Welcome back to Kingdoms at Night. Tonight, we leave the noise of the modern world behind and drift toward one of the oldest landscapes on Earth, a desert plateau under moonlight, a monument older than memory, a question that has followed travellers, scholars, dreamers, and kings for thousands of years. This is a story of stone, silence, legend, and the careful space between evidence and imagination. And before we begin, if you enjoy quiet journeys through ancient mysteries, consider subscribing to Kingdoms at Night. And if you are listening from somewhere in the world tonight, leave a comment with your country or city. It is always fascinating to know where these stories are being heard. So settle in, let the night grow quiet around you, and when you are ready, we begin beneath the gaze of the Sphinx. At night the Sphinx is silent, but beneath its pores the stone may not be solid. Seismic surveys have detected anomalies below and around the monument, strange returns in the limestone, shapes and spaces that some researchers have interpreted as possible cavities, perhaps natural hollows, perhaps old cuts in the bedrock, perhaps something shaped by human hands, long before anyone now living was born. Ancient traditions speak of hidden knowledge beneath sacred ground. Later legends speak of records sealed under the guardian of the horizon. Researchers have asked to look deeper. Permissions have been limited. Excavations have not opened the ground in the way so many people imagined they would. And so one of Egypt's oldest questions remains exactly where it has always been. Beneath the lion, beneath the desert, beneath the silence. This is not a story about proving a forbidden truth. It is not a story about turning legend into fact. The evidence does not give us that kind of certainty. The surveys do not confirm a lost library. The ancient texts do not point with a clear finger to one sealed door beneath one pore. But they do something almost as powerful. They keep returning us to the same place, to the Giza plateau, to the enormous face in the night, to the pores stretched forward across the sand, to the idea that somewhere under the oldest guardian in Egypt there may be a space that no living person has fully entered, mapped, or explained. That is the mystery we are entering tonight, not with noise, not with certainty, but slowly, the way you might approach a very old door and place your hand against the stone, feeling for the faintest breath of air from the other side. Now let the desert return. There is a place on earth where the night feels older than almost anywhere else. It is not a city. It is not only a ruin. It is a limestone ridge above the western bank of the Nile, where the desert begins in earnest, and the rock beneath your feet has been carved by hands whose names, whose prayers, whose reasons have drifted so far from us that we can only guess at them through fragments. The wind moves across it without hurry, carrying grains of sand so fine they feel like breath against skin. The sky above is enormous. Stars wheel overhead in arcs that have not changed in 10,000 years. The same stars that burned above this plateau when the first stones were dragged into place. The same stars that burned above whoever carved a face into living limestone and left it staring east, always east, toward the horizon where the sun rises over a world that has collapsed, rebuilt, crumbled again, and forgotten nearly everything it once knew. And beneath that face, beneath the enormous pores stretched forward into the dark, the question waits in the stone. What is beneath you? What have you been keeping all this time? Lie still if you're comfortable. Let the night widen around the plateau. Let the moonlight fall on the Sphinx. Let the mystery remain gentle but not empty. Because tonight, the question is not only whether there is a chamber. It is why, after all the scans, all the traditions, all the careful denials and cautious explanations, the idea of a hidden space beneath the Sphinx still refuses to disappear. Before we descend into the mystery of what lies beneath, it is worth spending a moment with what stands above, because the Sphinx itself, even before you ask about its secrets, is already a kind of riddle. The proportions are strange, if you know where to look. The body of the Sphinx is massive. It sprawls across the plateau in the posture of a resting lion, enormous, ancient, its stone worn in ways that have started their own controversy. But the head, the face, seems smaller than it should be for a body of that size. Not dramatically smaller, not obviously wrong to a casual eye. But to someone who studies proportion in ancient Egyptian sculpture, something about the relationship between head and body carries a quiet irregularity that asks a question it does not immediately answer. One possibility is simple. The head was recarved. Perhaps the face you see today is not the face that was originally cut. Perhaps the original head, whatever it was, whatever it looked like, whoever it belonged to, was chiseled away at some point in antiquity, and a new face was carved from the remaining stone. If you reduce a head, the body stays the same size. The proportions shift. The original harmony is quietly lost. The idea that the Sphinx's head was recarved is not fringe speculation. It is discussed among scholars, geologists, and Egyptologists with varying degrees of seriousness. Some dismiss it. Some find the evidence for it quietly compelling. The question of whose face was carved there first, and why it was changed, is one of those mysteries that lives in the negative space of what we do not know. Whose face is it? The traditional answer is Khafre, a pharaoh of the Old Kingdom who built the second of the 3 great pyramids on the Giza plateau, the one that still has its original casing stones near the top, the one that appears taller than its neighbour Khufu's pyramid, because it was built on higher ground. The conventional timeline places Khafre at roughly 2500 BCE, and the Sphinx is traditionally understood as his monument, carved during his reign, wearing his face, serving as a guardian for his funerary complex. But this answer has always rested on slightly softer ground than it appears. There is no inscription from the Old Kingdom, not a single carving, not a single text from Khafre's own time, that explicitly states he built the Sphinx. The connection comes from context, from proximity, from a causeway that links the Sphinx temple to Khafre's pyramid complex, from a fragment of a statue found in the Valley Temple nearby. These are reasonable inferences, they are not confessions, and the absence of a direct written claim, in a civilization that was not shy about celebrating the achievements of its kings, has always been a small, quiet hole in the conventional story. Perhaps the deeper mystery is not how the Sphinx was built, but when. And this is where the ground beneath the mystery begins to shift. In the late 20th century, a geologist named Robert Schoch looked at the Sphinx enclosure, the rectangular trench carved into the bedrock that the Sphinx sits within, and saw something that the conventional chronology of Egyptology did not expect. Water erosion, not wind erosion, not sand erosion. The undulating, rounded, wave-like weathering patterns in the walls of the Sphinx enclosure look, to Schoch's trained eye, like the kind of erosion that is caused by prolonged heavy rainfall soaking into limestone over centuries, not the surface-level horizontal erosion produced by wind-blown sand. The significance of this is difficult to overstate quietly. Egypt has been dry for a very long time. The Sahara has been desert, or close to it, for roughly the last 5,000 years. Before that, in an earlier climatic period, the region was wetter. There were rains. There were rivers and lakes and grasslands where the desert now is. This period is sometimes called the African humid period, and it ended somewhere around 3,500 to 5,000 BCE. If the erosion patterns in the Sphinx enclosure were caused by rain, then the Sphinx, or at least the initial carving, must predate the drying of the climate, which would place it not in 2,500 BCE, not in the reign of Khafre, but somewhere in a period so early that it falls before what we consider the beginning of ancient Egyptian civilization. Schoch does not claim the Sphinx is 10,000 years old as a certainty. He is a scientist and he is careful with his language. He says the evidence suggests an earlier origin. He says the weathering patterns are consistent with an older date. He says the question deserves serious attention. The Egyptological mainstream has largely resisted this reading, and this is understandable in its way. The conventional reconstruction of ancient history is not arbitrary. It is built from enormous amounts of evidence, from thousands of excavations, from the careful reading of texts and inscriptions and artifacts assembled over more than 2 centuries of scholarship. To accept that the Sphinx is significantly older than its accepted date would require not just a revision of one monument's timeline, but a rethinking of what was possible in human history at that remote period. It would imply a civilization advanced enough to carve a monument of that scale at a time when, as far as we currently know, nothing like that civilization should have existed. And that implication is where the mystery truly deepens. Because if the Sphinx is older than we think, if it was carved by hands from a civilization we have not yet found or cannot yet name, then what else might have been built at that time? What else might have been left behind? What might have been sealed beneath the bedrock of Giza, waiting for a world that would one day be ready to look inside? The answer, if it ever existed, has faded into silence. Or it is still there, still waiting, still sealed. There is a stone tablet standing between the front paws of the Sphinx. It has been there for more than 3,000 years. It is called the Dream Stele, and it tells a story. The story is about a young prince. His name was Thutmose, not yet a pharaoh, not yet Thutmose IV, just a prince of the new kingdom, a young man who liked to hunt in the desert near Memphis. One afternoon, after a long day of hunting, he lay down to rest in the shadow of the Sphinx's enormous head, which even then rose above the desert sand that buried the body almost entirely, and the Sphinx spoke to him. In the dream, or the vision, the text does not always make the distinction clear, the Sphinx spoke to him as a god. It called itself Harmachis, a solar deity associated with the rising sun on the horizon, and it made a bargain with the prince. "Clear away the sand," the Sphinx said. "My body is buried. I am suffocated by the desert that has crept over me. Free me from this weight, and I will give you the kingship of Egypt." The young Thutmose woke from his dream. He looked up at the face of the Sphinx, enormous above him in the afternoon light, and he made a vow. He became pharaoh. He cleared the sand. He commissioned the stele that now stands between the paws, recording the dream, the bargain, and the gratitude of a king to a god made of stone and mystery. But the stele does not tell us what the Sphinx truly is. It does not tell us how old the Sphinx was already when the young prince lay down to dream beneath it. It does not tell us what, if anything, was already sealed beneath the stone upon which the prince rested. The dream stele is, in a quiet way, a perfect metaphor for everything this mystery involves. A young man asleep beside an ancient secret. A voice speaking to him from somewhere he cannot fully see. A bargain made in the borderland between waking and sleeping. A truth offered that is not entirely explained. It could be a story about power and legitimacy. A pharaoh justifying his claim to the throne through divine visitation. It almost certainly is that on one level. The stele served political purposes. It told the world, the gods chose me. But there is something else in the story that lingers in the quiet. The Sphinx in the dream is buried. It is suffocating. It has been covered over by time, by sand, by forgetting. It asks to be remembered, and it promises, in return for being remembered, that something good will come. Maybe the deeper mystery is not only what lies beneath the Sphinx. Maybe it's why the Sphinx keeps appearing in human memory at the edge of sleep, in a prince's dream 3,000 years ago, and in the imaginations of everyone who has ever stood before it in the early morning light and felt, without being able to fully say why, that the stone is not entirely silent. To understand what might have been placed beneath the Sphinx, or to at least imagine it with any historical weight, it helps to sit for a moment with the world that existed when it was carved. And here the mystery multiplies, because the world depends entirely on when we believe the carving happened. If the Sphinx was carved in approximately 2500 BCE, during the reign of Khafra, or possibly his predecessor Khafra's father Khufu, then it emerged from the world of the Old Kingdom, one of the most extraordinary concentrations of human creative and organizational power the ancient world ever produced. The Old Kingdom of Egypt is the world of the Great Pyramids. It's a world in which a centralized state had existed for roughly 500 years, in which a sophisticated administrative bureaucracy governed a river-dependent civilization stretching from the delta in the north to the first cataract of the Nile far to the south, in which writing had been in use for centuries and had accumulated enough literature that the pyramid texts, the oldest religious writings in continuous use in human history, were already ancient by the time they were carved onto tomb walls. This was a world that thought deeply about death and what comes after. A world in which the relationship between the living and the dead was not metaphorical but practical. The dead had needs, made demands, needed feeding and housing and ritual attendance. The tombs at Giza are not merely graves, they are houses for the afterlife, stocked with everything the dead might require: food, tools, furniture, boats, servants in effigy, prayers written in stone to protect the soul on its journey through a darkness that was mapped, named, and feared. The Sphinx in this world would have been a guardian of that threshold, the protector of the royal dead, the watcher at the boundary between the world of the living and the world of eternity. But if Schock's water erosion argument is correct, if the Sphinx is significantly older, carved perhaps 6,000 to 8,000 years ago or even earlier, then the world it came from is a world we cannot yet name. It predates the Old Kingdom by thousands of years. It predates the unification of Egypt. It predates, by the currently accepted chronologies, any civilization advanced enough to carve something of that scale and sophistication, unless there was something before what we currently accept as the beginning. This is the uncomfortable implication that the geological evidence, taken seriously, forces onto the table. We know that human beings were anatomically modern, cognitively capable of everything we are capable of, for roughly 300,000 years. The period of recognizable civilization, of writing and cities and complex social organization, covers perhaps 5,000 to 6,000 years of that span. The rest is, to varying degrees, prehistoric. But prehistoric does not mean simple. It means unrecorded. It means we cannot read their story directly, because they did not leave us texts. It means we know them, if at all, through the things they built and the tools they left and the traces of the fires they lit. What if some of them built more than we know? What if the traces are there but buried, not metaphorically but literally, under the sand and the millennia? What if the chamber beneath the Sphinx is one of those traces? There is something specific about the way water erodes limestone that matters here, and it is worth spending a moment with, because it is one of the places where the mystery and the science come closest together. When rain falls on limestone over a long period, the erosion it creates is vertical. The water runs down the face of the stone, and the channels it cuts run up and down, undulating, rounded at the bottom, creating a pattern that geologists call spalling and undercutting. The profile of a weathered limestone face looks, if you know what you're seeing, like a landscape shaped by water, moving along it over a very long time. Wind erosion looks different. Wind drives sand horizontally against the stone. The erosion it creates is horizontal, cutting into the face of the rock in parallel bands, wearing away the softer layers faster than the harder ones, and creating a layered, stratified appearance. The walls of the Sphinx enclosure, the vertical rock faces cut away around the Sphinx when the statue was carved, show what Robert Schoch and his colleagues describe as water erosion, not wind erosion. The profile of those walls carries the vertical rounded channels associated with prolonged rainfall. This is the geological heart of the argument. The question is not whether the Sphinx is old. Everyone agrees it is old. The question is how the erosion pattern got there, and whether it got there before or after the Sahara dried out. The conventional response from Egyptologists is that the erosion pattern can be explained by other means. By water pooling in the enclosure during rare but intense storms, by capillary action drawing water up through the limestone, by the complexity of a geological context that includes the proximity of the Nile flood plain. These are real mechanisms. They are not impossible explanations. But Schoch, who is a professional geologist with expertise specifically in rock weathering, finds them insufficient. The depth and character of the erosion, he argues, is simply too pronounced to be explained by the limited rainfall of historical Egypt. It requires a much longer, wetter period. It requires a climate that Egypt last had in the 5th or 6th millennium BCE. And he is not alone in this assessment. He has had support from other geologists, not from Egyptologists, who deal primarily in documentary and material evidence rather than geological processes, but from people who spend their careers reading rock faces the way others read texts. The argument has not been resolved. In a field as charged with institutional history and national identity as Egyptology, resolution often takes longer than it should. The question is not quite settled. The anomalies in the bedrock are not quite explained. The permits for excavation are not quite granted. The answer, if it ever existed in full, has faded into silence. Before the legend grows too large, pause for one physical moment. Forget Atlantis, forget prophecy, forget every dramatic headline. Listen only to the instrument. A signal goes down into the stone. It returns changed. Not everywhere, only in certain places, near the pores, under the body. In the ground where the question has always pointed. Science does not always speak in poetry, but sometimes what science finds is poetic despite itself. In the years following the Waseda University surveys and the work of Schoch and Debecki, a number of additional investigations attempted to map the subsurface of the Sphinx enclosure with greater precision. Ground-penetrating radar, which uses electromagnetic pulses rather than seismic sound waves, was applied to various areas around the Sphinx, the floor of the enclosure, the bedrock around the pores, the ground between the Sphinx temple and the statue itself. The results were not uniform. Some areas showed nothing unexpected. Others returned data that, when analysed, suggested the presence of cavities, spaces in the bedrock that did not behave the way undisturbed limestone should. The area beneath and immediately around the front pores has been described as anomalous in several reports and interpretations, though the exact meaning of those anomalies remains debated. There is also a tradition, among the workers and technicians who have done repair and restoration work on the Sphinx over the decades, of places where the stone sounds hollow when tapped. Not everywhere, but in specific locations the knock of a hand against the limestone returns a sound that carries something underneath it, a faint resonance, a slight emptiness in the echo. This is admittedly an impressionistic kind of evidence. Human ears are fallible instruments, and the desire to find something can create a perception of finding it. But the workers who report this are not, generally speaking, people trying to prove a theory. They are people doing a job, and the sound surprises them. There is also the matter of the Sphinx's own visible architecture. When the Sphinx was cleared of sand, which it has been several times in its long history, most comprehensively in the 19th and early 20th centuries, explorers found passages. There is a small shaft that descends into the back of the Sphinx, roughly where a lion's hindquarters would be. It leads a short distance down and then ends in a natural fault in the rock, a dead end by most accounts. There is a passage behind the head. These passages are not exactly secret. They have been documented, but they are generally described as natural fissures or incomplete workings, the result of ancient attempts to find or create chambers that were either abandoned or already emptied. Or perhaps they were not entrances at all. Perhaps they were maintenance passages for a larger structure below. The way a trapdoor in a floor might tell you that there is a basement, but tell you nothing about what is kept there. Another possibility waits in the shadows. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the seismic surveys is not what they found, but the shape of what they found. Beneath the front left paw of the Sphinx, the anomalous area reported by Schoch and Dubecki has often been described as unusually regular, perhaps even rectangular. Rectangles occur in nature. Crystals form rectangular structures. Rock can crack in straight lines. A rectangular void beneath the Sphinx does not prove the presence of a constructed room, but it is consistent with one. A rectangular room cut from limestone, perhaps lined with blocks, perhaps sealed with a stone door, perhaps holding something and perhaps empty. That shape, or the possibility of that shape, is what some readers of the data heard when the sound waves asked the ground a question. The instruments were asking, "What are you?" And the ground replied with a shape, and then the ground went quiet again, and nothing further was permitted. What we know is only a fragment. The Giza plateau is larger than most people imagine. It is not simply the 3 pyramids and the Sphinx arranged neatly on a postcard backdrop. It is a complex, a vast, ancient infrastructure of temples, causeways, boat pits, workers' villages, cemeteries, and sacred alignments covering several square kilometers of desert above the Nile's western bank. The western bank was always associated with the dead in ancient Egyptian cosmology, because that is where the sun sets, where the light enters its nightly journey through the underworld before rising again in the east. The Sphinx stands at the eastern edge of this complex. It is the guardian of the threshold between the desert and the cultivated land, between the kingdom of the dead and the world of the living, between the plateau of monuments and the city that has, over millennia, grown steadily closer. Beneath the plateau there are tunnels. This is not a secret exactly. It is simply not talked about very much. Explorers have found tunnel entrances, some carved, some natural, at various points around the plateau. Some of these tunnels are quite clearly ancient. Some are associated with tomb complexes. Some lead nowhere, ending in sand and collapsed rock. Some have been sealed. The entire limestone formation upon which the pyramids and the Sphinx were built is riddled with natural fissures and cavities. Limestone is a relatively soft rock in geological terms, and it dissolves slowly in water, creating voids and channels over thousands and millions of years. The Giza plateau is not a uniform solid mass. It is, like so much of Egypt's geology, more complex beneath the surface than it appears from above. The ancient Egyptians knew this. They were sophisticated engineers. They would have surveyed the bedrock before and during construction. They would have been aware of the natural cavities in the rock. In some cases, those natural spaces were incorporated into the designs of their structures, extended, modified, sealed. The question is not simply whether the instruments have found anomalies beneath the Sphinx. Some surveys suggest they have. The more delicate question is what those anomalies represent. Natural features, altered rock, old cuts, empty spaces, or something shaped by human hands. And still, the question remains. In the 1990s, a team from Waseda University in Japan conducted a survey of the Sphinx and its enclosure using seismic refraction techniques, a method of sending sound waves into the ground and measuring how they bounce back. What they reported in the bedrock beneath the Sphinx was anomalous. The sound behaved differently in certain areas than one would expect from uniform limestone. The data suggested possible cavities, though it did not prove what those spaces were. The Waseda team's findings were tentative. They noted the anomalies and called for further study. They did not claim to have found a chamber. They said something unusual was there and that someone should look more carefully. Around the same time, a researcher named Thomas de Becky, working alongside geologist Robert Schoch, used seismic analysis to examine the area around the Sphinx's pores. Their instruments reportedly detected an anomalous area beneath the front left paw of the Sphinx, a space in the bedrock that some interpreted as more regular, more room-like than a typical natural void, possibly rectangular, possibly shaped by the geometry of cracks and stone, possibly something designed. The word itself must remain careful, because instruments do not see the way eyes see. They infer, they listen, they return patterns. This finding was not loudly announced. It appeared in academic contexts, in technical papers, alongside the broader discussion of the Sphinx's geological history. And then, quietly, permission for further exploration became more difficult, more restricted, more entangled in the responsibilities of preservation and control. The reasons given were preservation. The Sphinx is fragile. It has been deteriorating for decades. The limestone crumbling, the mortar of repair work failing, the surface continuing to erode in the damp winter air and the dry summer heat. Driving seismic sound waves into the bedrock was potentially damaging. These reasons are not unreasonable, but they did not make the question disappear. They simply added a new layer to it. What we know is only a fragment. Here the story changes temperature. It leaves the dream for a moment and enters the world of permits, conservation, politics, national heritage, and fear of damage. A sealed space is one kind of mystery, a closed gate is another. The question of why the Egyptian government has not permitted thorough excavation beneath the Sphinx is one that carries many layers. Some of those layers are simple and practical. The Sphinx is in a delicate physical condition. Its limestone has been deteriorating for centuries, the surface crumbling, the neck, structurally the most vulnerable point of the sculpture, showing signs of weakness, the repair work that has been done over decades sometimes causing as much damage as it prevents. Any excavation beneath the structure risks destabilizing it further. A monument that has survived 4,000 years or more should not be casually drilled into on the basis of seismic anomalies. This is a reasonable position. Conservation is genuinely important. The Sphinx is irreplaceable. But this position does not entirely account for the specific pattern of restriction that has surrounded the site. Multiple requests and proposals for deeper investigation have met caution, delay, restriction, or denial. The Egyptian Antiquities Organization and its successors have often been reluctant to let this question become a public spectacle, especially when it is tied to claims that move beyond cautious archaeology. There is a human tendency, across all cultures and all bureaucracies, to protect what you are responsible for by restricting access to it. The smaller the circle of those who can approach the mystery, the more control you maintain over what the mystery means. The Egyptian state has a deep investment in the interpretation of its own ancient monuments. The story of ancient Egypt, its grandeur, its antiquity, its meaning, is not merely academic. It is part of a national identity, an economic engine of tourism, a source of pride and authority. Any significant revision of the conventional story carries implications that extend far beyond archaeology. If the Sphinx is significantly older than Khafra's reign, that changes the story. If there is something sealed beneath it, even something modest like a ritual deposit, a passage, or an unknown architectural feature, that would still change part of the story. It raises questions that are very difficult to answer on a world stage. It invites interpretations that range from the rigorous to the wildly speculative, and distinguishing between them in public requires a kind of nuanced communication that monuments, by their nature, do not easily permit. It is also true that in Egypt, as in many places where ancient sites are densely concentrated, there is a long history of unauthorized excavation, treasure hunting, looting, the quiet removal of objects that disappear into private collections and are never formally recorded. Restricting access to the Sphinx enclosure is, at least in part, genuine protection against this. But still, the surveys reported anomalies. Further access was limited. The ground was not opened in the way the question demands, and the question remains precisely as unanswered as it was before the instruments were ever brought to the site. This is the nature of mysteries that live in institutional spaces. They are not only geological or historical, they are political, they are territorial. They are about who has the right to ask the question and who has the right to receive the answer. The answer, if it ever existed in full, has faded into silence. There is a specific episode from the 1990s that is worth dwelling on, not for the drama it contains, but for the quieter implications of what it suggests. A researcher named Joseph Shaw, affiliated with Florida State University, obtained a permit from the Egyptian Antiquities Authority to conduct ground-penetrating radar surveys of the Giza Plateau in 1996. The permit was legitimate. The work was planned to be scientific and non-invasive. No digging, no drilling, just electromagnetic pulses sent into the ground and the echoes recorded. The project attracted controversy almost immediately. Part of the controversy came from Shaw's broader associations. He had connections to the Edgar Cayce Foundation, which had long been interested in the Hall of Records prediction. In the deeply territorial world of academic Egyptology, the suggestion that a researcher connected to a mystical tradition was being permitted to survey the plateau felt, to some, like the wrong people being allowed to ask the wrong questions. There were public disputes. There was media attention. There were accusations of agenda-driven research. The Egyptian authorities became uncomfortable. The permit was complicated, restricted, and eventually the project ended without the kind of comprehensive survey that had been hoped for. What the survey did find in the limited areas it was permitted to examine was consistent with earlier findings. Anomalies in the bedrock, patterns inconsistent with solid limestone, suggestions of subsurface voids, and then the gate closed again. The lesson, if it can be called that, is this. The mystery of the chamber beneath the Sphinx is not only a mystery about ancient Egypt, it is also a mystery about how modern institutions handle old secrets, about who gets to look, about what questions are permitted, about the strange alchemy between scientific curiosity, political caution, spiritual tradition, and the very human desire to keep some things sealed. The Sphinx has been a gate for a very long time. Gates keep things in as much as they keep things out. The official position of Egyptian antiquities authorities on the question of chambers beneath the Sphinx has been, over the decades, characterized by something that is difficult to categorize simply as denial. It is closer to silence. There have been statements that all exploration of the site has been completed. There have been claims that any anomalies found by survey have been fully explained. There have been pointed refusals of specific excavation requests without detailed explanations. There has been, at moments, active discouragement of the public discussion of survey results. Not outright suppression, but a kind of institutional cooling, a withdrawal of enthusiasm from a subject that carries too many associations with treasure hunters, conspiracy theorists, and the kind of alternative history speculation that serious archaeologists find professionally painful. This is understandable. The academic field of Egyptology has spent more than a century and a half contending with the margins of popular interest. With pyramid power theorists and ancient astronaut enthusiasts, and the people who insist that no ancient civilization could have built the Great Pyramid without supernatural assistance, ignoring the enormous body of evidence showing precisely how human beings organised, fed and directed thousands of workers in an extraordinary engineering project over decades. The legitimate science is real. The pyramids were built by human hands. The organisational achievement is staggering. The spiritual worldview that animated the project is profound. None of this requires the supernatural, and the accumulated evidence for the conventional understanding of how the pyramids were built is enormous and compelling. But the Sphinx is not quite the pyramid. The pyramid's construction is documented, not in complete detail, but in enough detail that the broad outline is clear. Worker villages have been found and excavated. Administrative records have been discovered. The logistics of the project, while extraordinary, are not mysterious in the same way. The Sphinx carries a different kind of question, not how, but what. What is beneath it, and what was sealed there, and by whom, and when, and why? These questions have not been answered by the accumulated evidence in the same way. The silence of the authorities is not evidence of a conspiracy. It is evidence of the very human tendency to protect a complex, charged and multiply interpreted sight from the chaotic possibilities that open investigation might produce. But the silence does not make the anomalies disappear. It simply leaves them where they have always been. In the ground, in the dark, waiting. We have been circling the question very carefully. Now gently, let us sit with it directly for a moment. If there is a chamber beneath the Sphinx, and the evidence, while not conclusive, is genuinely suggestive, what might it contain? The possibilities spread in several directions, each one carrying a different weight, a different implication. Perhaps the simplest possibility is that it is empty. A natural void in the limestone, perhaps enlarged by ancient workers at some point, perhaps used briefly and then sealed again. The ancient Egyptians cut many tunnels, shafts and rooms into the bedrock at Giza. Not all of them tombs, not all of them sacred, some of them unfinished, abandoned, repurposed, or sealed for reasons that no longer survive in the record. An empty room beneath the Sphinx would be significant in itself, proof that the ancient architects knew it was there and chose to seal it, but it would not carry the weight of the other possibilities. Perhaps it contains construction-related materials, offerings placed at the founding of the Sphinx complex, ritual deposits, as was the Egyptian custom, placed in the earth when a sacred structure was dedicated, small objects, sealed jars, symbolic deposits that marked the beginning of the monument's sacred life. These would be archaeologically important and spiritually significant, but would not rewrite history. Perhaps it contains records. This is the possibility that lives in the longer shadow. Records do not have to mean papyrus scrolls. Those would not survive sealed in limestone for 4,000 years, let alone 10,000. Records, in the broader sense, might mean inscribed stone, carved writing on sealed walls, hieroglyphs or a yet unread script recording something that the people who placed them there wanted to preserve against the erosion of time. Or they might mean something more abstract, a geometric encoding, a stellar alignment, a pattern in the architecture itself that carries meaning in a form that requires interpretation rather than translation. Or perhaps the chamber contains objects, artifacts from a world we have not yet recovered, tools, ritual items, fragments of a material culture whose absence from the archaeological record has always puzzled researchers who notice the gap between what is implied by the complexity of early Egyptian civilization and what can currently be traced back in time. Perhaps it contains something we have no category for yet, something that changes the picture in a way we cannot anticipate because we do not know what the picture is missing. These are not equal possibilities. The simpler ones are more likely, if probability matters in a situation where we have almost no data, empty rooms and construction deposits are common in ancient Egypt. Repositories of civilization-defining knowledge are not attested anywhere in the archaeological record in the way tradition claims they are. But the reported seismic anomaly is real as a reported finding. The surveys reported something unusual, and until the ground is opened, we do not know which possibility is the true one. There is a way of opening ancient things that feels almost violent. A door is found, a stone is moved, a sealed passage is broken. Air that has not touched the world for centuries rushes out, carrying dust, spores, silence, and the last breath of whatever was kept inside. Cameras arrive, voices rise. The moment becomes a spectacle before it becomes a study. This is the way the imagination often wants discovery to happen. Sudden, dramatic, final. But archaeology, at its best, moves differently. It moves with brushes and measurements, with grids and photographs, with patient recording of every layer before the next layer is touched. It moves with the knowledge that once a sealed place is opened, it cannot be sealed again in the same way. The original condition is gone forever. The relationship between dust and floor, object and wall, stone and silence, all of it changes the moment human hands enter. This is why the question beneath the Sphinx is so difficult. If there is a void beneath the monument, opening it would not simply satisfy curiosity. It would alter one of the most fragile and symbolic archaeological landscapes on Earth. A narrow drill hole might seem harmless from a distance, but the Sphinx is not an isolated sculpture standing on a museum floor. It is part of the bedrock itself. It is a body of weathered limestone cut from layers of stone that have cracked, eroded, been patched, and been repaired for thousands of years. To touch the ground beneath it is to touch its foundation. And foundations are not only physical, they are historical, political, spiritual, emotional. The Sphinx belongs to Egypt, but it also belongs to the human imagination. It belongs to scholars who measure it, to conservators who try to save it, to people who live in its shadow, to children who first see its face in a school book, to dreamers who imagine a chamber below, and to the ancient dead whose world surrounded it before any of us were here to ask questions. This does not mean the question should never be asked. It means the question must be asked carefully. Perhaps one day, technology will make the choice easier. Perhaps a new form of non-invasive scanning will map the limestone in such detail that every void, every fracture, every ancient cut, every natural pocket and every possible chamber can be distinguished without moving a single stone. Perhaps the ground will be understood before it is opened. Perhaps a path will be found that lets curiosity and preservation stand together rather than against each other. Until then, the unopened place remains both protected and unknown. And that is the tension. To preserve is to wait. To discover is to risk. The Sphinx, patient beneath the stars, seems to understand both. There is another possibility that is rarely loved by the imagination, but it deserves tenderness. Perhaps the chamber, if one exists, is ordinary, not empty of meaning, not worthless, but ordinary in the way real archaeology often is ordinary. A small space cut into bedrock, a passage used for maintenance, a symbolic shaft, a ritual deposit, a forgotten cavity that ancient workers noticed and adapted, a void that mattered only because of where it was and not because of what it contained. This would disappoint many people. There would be no golden archive, no sealed library, no tablet explaining the origin of civilization, no lost map of an earlier world, no final proof that all of history must be rewritten in a single afternoon. And yet an ordinary room beneath the Sphinx would still be extraordinary, because ordinary in archaeology does not mean unimportant. A single workman's mark on a stone can change how we understand a monument. A broken tool can tell us more about construction than a royal inscription. A piece of pottery sealed in a foundation deposit can date a sacred structure more honestly than a legend. A small shaft that once seemed meaningless can reveal how ancient builders thought about the relationship between earth, sky, death, and rebirth. If a small chamber exists beneath the Sphinx, and if it contains only dust, or a rough-cut wall, or a stone blocking, or a few objects placed there at the moment of foundation, that would still be a voice from the ancient world. Not a shout, a whisper, and whispers are often what survive. The ancient past rarely gives us the grand answers we ask for. It gives us fragments, a name without a face without a name, a doorway without a room without an inscription whose most important line has been broken away. The work of history is not to demand that fragments become whole. It is to sit with the fragment long enough that it begins to speak in its own scale. So perhaps, if the ground beneath the Sphinx is ever opened, the result will be smaller than the myth and deeper than the headline. Perhaps it will not prove Atlantis. Perhaps it will not overturn Egyptology. Perhaps it will simply add one more strange, careful piece to the long puzzle of Giza. A chamber of dust, a sealed cut in the bedrock, a mark left by someone whose name is gone. And sometimes that is enough, because the real ancient world is not made less beautiful by becoming more human. Now the scientific question meets the old dream. This is where the mystery becomes dangerous if handled carelessly, because longing can begin to dress itself as proof. So we will move carefully. There are traditions that predate modern Egyptology by centuries. Some speak broadly of hidden rooms, sacred writings, buried wisdom, and sealed places beneath the desert of Egypt. Later interpreters, especially in the modern period, drew some of those traditions toward the Giza Plateau and toward the Sphinx specifically. A library of stone, a sealed room containing the records of a civilization so ancient that even the ancient Egyptians understood it only as myth. Modern writers often connect this longing to the Egyptian idea of the first time, Zep Tepi, the sacred beginning when order first emerged from chaos. The Greeks, when they came to Egypt and absorbed its wisdom and its stories, wrote about underground chambers filled with wisdom from before the flood. Medieval Arab scholars who passed through Egypt and looked at the pyramids and the Sphinx recorded local traditions about hidden rooms beneath the monuments, rooms that the people of the land said had always been there, had always been sealed, would always be waiting. This tradition is, in the rational sense, a tradition. It is a story that has been passed from generation to generation, changing slightly with each telling, accumulating layers of interpretation and mythology, and wishful thinking over thousands of years. But traditions do not always come from nothing. Sometimes they come from memory, sometimes from theology, sometimes from political myth, sometimes from the human need to place what was lost somewhere safe beneath the earth. In the 20th century, the tradition found its most famous modern voice in the words of an American mystic named Edgar Cayce, who claimed in a series of trance readings given in the 1920s and 1930s that beneath the right paw of the Great Sphinx lay a sealed chamber. He called it the Hall of Records. He said it contained the documented history of a civilization called Atlantis, that it was placed there by survivors of that civilization before it sank, a repository of everything they knew, sealed against time and waiting for a moment in human history when the world would be ready to receive it. Cayce said the chamber would be opened, or would make itself known, around the year 1998. 1998 came and went. The chamber, if it exists, was not opened. Edgar Cayce was a man of sincere conviction, and his broader legacy as a healer and psychic reader is a separate conversation from the Sphinx. The Hall of Records prediction is, On its surface, the kind of prophecy that sounds dramatic and then quietly fails. And yet, strangely, uncomfortably, some of the best-known modern surveys and public controversies around the Sphinx took place in the decades surrounding the period his followers expected. Researchers were, in fact, looking. Permissions and restrictions did in fact become part of the story. This does not prove the prophecy. It is probably a coincidence of timing. And yet the questions the surveys raised were not Cayce's questions. They were scientific questions. They were the quiet, careful results of instruments measuring the density of stone and finding something unexpected. The mystery does not belong to Cayce, but the tradition he was drawing from, the ancient, layered, cross-cultural tradition of a sealed chamber beneath the plateau. That tradition is older than his voice by thousands of years, and what gives it a quiet persistence, long after the specific predictions have failed, is that new observations are often folded back into the older story, not proof, not confirmation. Fragments that people arrange into meaning. The difference between evidence and proof is one of the things that makes this mystery livable. Proof would close it. Evidence simply deepens it. Ancient Egyptian texts contain themes that later readers have connected to this tradition. Though the connection must be handled carefully, there is a body of writing discovered at the ancient site of Edfu in Upper Egypt, inscriptions carved on the walls of a temple that was built in the Ptolemaic period, perhaps 300 years before the Common Era, but which records texts and traditions that are far, far older than the building itself. These inscriptions are known as the Edfu building texts, and they describe the origins of Egyptian sacred architecture in terms that are quietly extraordinary. They speak of a primordial island, a place that existed at the beginning of time before the known world took its current shape, where a group of divine beings, described variously as the sages, the Shebtiu or the followers of Horus, first established the patterns from which all of Egypt's temples and sacred places would later descend. This primordial island was the home of the first time, Zep-Tepi in the original language, the mythological first moment when order emerged from chaos, when the sun first rose, when the gods first took form. The texts describe these divine beings as carrying with them, from the first time, a sacred plan, a blueprint of sacred geometry and cosmic order that was to be embedded in every sacred structure they built or inspired. And they describe hiding things, sealing things, in the earth beneath sacred places to be preserved against the destruction they knew was coming. There is something in these texts, and in the later imagination that grew around them, about sacred plans, hidden foundations, and knowledge protected beneath holy ground. Not a map to the Sphinx, not proof of a chamber, but a pattern of thought. The most sacred things are often guarded, hidden, placed beneath thresholds, entrusted to the earth. The ancient Egyptians had a name for the Sphinx, not the name we use, that comes from the Greeks. The Egyptians called it Horemaket, Horus on the horizon, or sometimes Horemaket, Horus of the two horizons, the guardian of the place where day and night meet, the watcher at the edge of two worlds. If a later storyteller were going to imagine where sacred records might have been hidden, where a civilization might place what it feared losing, the Sphinx would feel almost inevitable. Beneath the watcher, beneath the guardian, beneath the eyes that never close, maybe the truth lies somewhere between memory and ruin. There is a list. It is ancient beyond easy reckoning, and most of the world has never heard of it. In the Turin King List, a papyrus document compiled during the reign of Rameses II, approximately 1279 BCE, there is a section that is unlike the rest of the document. The Turin King List is, for most of its length, a practical administrative record, a list of pharaohs and the lengths of their reigns, going back to the earliest dynasties of unified Egypt. It is a historical document in a reasonably straightforward sense, but at the beginning of the list, before the first recognizable human pharaoh, there are entries for something else entirely. Gods, divine beings, entities described as reigning before the age of human kings. And before even those divine reigns, there is a phrase, repeated, enigmatic, without explanation, that refers to the followers of Horus, the Shemsu Hor. The Turin list assigns them a combined reign of over 13,000 years, before the first human dynasty of Egypt, before the unification of the two lands, before the horizon of recorded history as we understand it. The conventional reading is that these entries are mythological or theological, rather than straightforward historical claims, but the texts do not always make the mythological distinction as clearly as we might like. The Egyptians themselves did not always draw a sharp line between sacred time and human time. The first time was not only a myth to them, it was a reality they tried to reproduce in their temples, in their rituals, in the precise alignments of their monuments to stars and seasons. The past was not over. It was present. It was enacted again with every sunrise, every flood of the Nile, every ceremony conducted in the exact manner it had been conducted since the first time established the pattern. If the followers of Horus were real, even in some attenuated or transformed sense, if they were the memory of an actual early civilization, a people who had knowledge that later Egyptians preserved in symbolic form, then what they left behind matters. And what the Edfu building texts describe them leaving behind, hidden, sealed, buried beneath the foundations of sacred places, becomes something other than mythology. It becomes a question that archaeology may one day test, not a conclusion, a question waiting for careful evidence. The ancient Egyptian text known as the Westcar Papyrus contains a scene that, in its quiet way, is one of the most haunting fragments in the entire literary legacy of that civilization. A pharaoh, Khufu, the builder of the Great Pyramid, asks a wise man about hidden chambers. Specifically, he asks about the sealed rooms of the sanctuary of Thoth, rooms whose contents he desires to place within his own monument. The wise man's response is that he cannot tell Khufu the number of those rooms. No one can, but he knows of a man who can find them, the sanctuary of Thoth. Thoth was the Egyptian god of writing, of wisdom, of the moon, of measurement, of all things recorded and hidden. He was the keeper of divine knowledge, his sanctuary, his hidden rooms. These appear in Egyptian texts not as metaphor but as location, as a place that exists or existed in the physical world. The Book of Thoth, a legendary text described in Egyptian tradition as containing all the knowledge of the gods written by Thoth himself, was said to be hidden, sealed, buried somewhere in Egypt, beneath the sand, beneath the river, beneath a monument, waiting. Some traditions place it at Hermopolis, the city of Thoth. Others place it at the bottom of the Nile, and later interpreters, quietly, persistently, across different eras and different sources, drew such stories toward the desert west of Memphis, toward the plateau, toward the Guardian. The records tell us what survived, but not everything that was lost. The ancient Egyptians called it Zep Tepi, the first time, the moment before the moment, the origin from which all sacred order descended. It was not mythology in the way we tend to use that word, as something invented, as a narrative whose deeper purpose is symbolic rather than descriptive. For the ancient Egyptians, Zep Tepi was a real point in time. It was the moment when the land first rose from the primordial waters of chaos, when the first sunrise happened, when the first sacred place was established on the first ground that had ever been dry. Everything that mattered in Egyptian religious life was oriented towards Zep Tepi. Temples were built to replicate it. Rituals were performed to return to it. The alignment of sacred structures with specific stars and specific moments in the astronomical calendar was a way of touching the first time again, of reaching backward through the centuries to the original pattern, the original order, the sacred geometry that had been laid down before history began. And the first time was associated in the deepest layers of Egyptian tradition with figures who came before the known gods, who came from an island, who brought knowledge, who sealed what they brought beneath the earth when they understood their world was ending. These are not simple stories. They have the texture of something that was once more specific, a real memory perhaps of real events, passed down through so many generations of retelling that the specifics had been worn smooth and the narrative had taken on the rounded quality of myth. The way a river stone is still a stone, but no longer has the sharp edges it once carried. The Edfu building texts describe the builders of the first sacred places in terms that are precise in their architectural and geographical instructions, but vague in their chronology. They know where the sacred hill was, they know what was built there, they know what was placed beneath it, but when this happened, the text places it in a time before time, which is the only honest answer that memory can give for something so old. Far from these first ruins, another trace appears, because this pattern of a sacred site built on a primordial hill of hidden knowledge sealed beneath the foundation appears not only in Egyptian tradition, it appears in Sumerian texts about the foundations of temples. It appears in Hindu tradition about the axis mundi, the sacred centre of the world beneath which the divine plan is buried. It appears in traditions from cultures that had no contact with each other that we can document. The same image, the same intuition, the same story of something hidden beneath the holy ground. This kind of convergence does not prove anything, but it asks a question. What did all of these different peoples separated by oceans and centuries remember? The Sphinx is a lion, or rather it is a lion below and a king above, the fusion of two powers that the ancient Egyptians regarded as the most formidable imaginable. The lion was strength, ferocity, the protection of the territory. The king was divine authority, order, the intermediary between the human and the sacred. To combine them was to make something that could not be threatened, a protector that was also a god. The lion lay at the horizon. In Egyptian iconography, a creature called the Akka is sometimes depicted as two lions sitting back to back, one facing east, one facing west, at the boundary between yesterday and tomorrow, between the setting sun and the rising sun, between the world of the living and the world of the dead. The Akka guards the passage of the sun through the underworld. The Akka protects the threshold. The Great Sphinx, facing east with the lion's body resting on the desert, occupies exactly this symbolic position. It guards the passage, it watches the horizon, it sits at the threshold between the land of the living and the plateau of the dead. And in Egyptian tradition, the threshold is where you hide the most important things. Not in the middle, not in the obvious centre of the sacred space, at the entrance, at the door, in the body of the guardian itself, or beneath it. Because what protects the threshold also protects whatever is concealed within it. The most sacred objects in Egyptian temples were kept in the innermost sanctuary, the most hidden, most guarded room at the far end of the temple, accessible only to the highest priests. But the temple was also itself a threshold, and the entrance to the temple complex was always flanked and guarded. The guardians at the gate carried within them, symbolically and sometimes literally, the power of everything they protected. Beneath the lion body of the Sphinx, carved from the living rock of the plateau that was the western edge of the world of the living, this is exactly where, if you were an ancient Egyptian of sufficient knowledge and sufficient purpose, you might choose to place something that needed to be kept safe forever. Not in the pyramid, not in the tomb. Those places, for all their grandeur, were known. Their locations were visible, their purposes declared. The pyramid announces itself across the desert. It says, "Here is a king, here is power, here is a civilization that built something meant to last." The chamber beneath the Sphinx, if it exists, is different. It does not announce, it waits. Every so often the story needs to lift its eyes from the ground, because the Sphinx does not only point downward into stone, it also looks east, toward the horizon, toward the stars, toward the first light. Before we speak of what might lie beneath the Sphinx, it is worth understanding what might have been thought to lie above it. The ancient Egyptians were meticulous observers of the night sky. They mapped the stars with a precision that took centuries to develop, and they embedded their understanding of the heavens into the landscape around them, aligning their monuments to specific stellar events, building temples whose inner sanctuaries caught the light of particular stars at particular times of year, designing their entire sacred geography as a kind of terrestrial mirror of the cosmos. The three great pyramids of Giza have been argued, by the researcher Robert Bauval, in a theory that has attracted both serious attention and serious criticism, to mirror the three stars of Orion's belt, Alnitak, Alnilam and Mintaka. The pyramid's slight offset from a perfect diagonal, and the relative difference in the smallest pyramid, closely matches the layout of the three belt stars and the slight dimness of one of them. Bauval calculated that the pyramid's alignment most precisely matches the position of Orion's belt stars as they would have appeared in the sky around 10,500 BCE, not 2,500 BCE. This is, again, a claim that has been contested. The matching of earthly monuments to celestial patterns is a practice fraught with confirmation bias, and there are strong statistical arguments about how often three roughly aligned objects of varying size will occur in both the sky and the earth without requiring any intentional connection. The Egyptological mainstream is skeptical, but the connection between Orion and the pyramids is not Bauval's invention. The ancient Egyptians themselves wrote about it. Orion, called Sa by the Egyptians, was one of the most sacred constellations in their cosmology. It was associated with Osiris, the god of resurrection and the dead, and the appearance of Orion in the night sky was connected to the rituals of burial and rebirth. The pyramid texts explicitly describe the dead pharaoh ascending to join Orion in the sky, and the Sphinx, with its eastward gaze, faces directly toward the point on the horizon where certain significant stellar events occur. In 10,500 BCE, the date that the Pyramid-Orion alignment is said to best match, the constellation Leo rose on the eastern horizon at the spring equinox dawn, in the position the Sphinx now faces. The Sphinx is a lion. It faces east. At the time when, according to the stellar argument, the monuments were first aligned, the sky showed a lion at the exact point where the Sphinx's gaze is fixed. This is a beautiful coincidence. It may be only that, a coincidence, a pattern that human minds find meaningful because we are pattern-finding creatures, and the ancient world is full of material for us to arrange into stories. Or it may be something else. A memory, a marker, a way of recording, in stone that would outlast any papyrus or inscription, the date of something important, the date of the first time, the moment from which everything else was measured. And if someone in that remote and largely unrecorded era was precise enough and far-thinking enough to record a date in stellar alignment, what else might they have recorded? In what form? In what sealed room? Imagine you are on the Giza Plateau 10,000 years ago, not imagining the pyramids. They are not there yet in this thought, not imagining the tourist paths and the light shows and the hotels on the horizon, just the plateau, the ridge of limestone rising above the valley, the desert beginning where the cultivation ends, the abrupt boundary between green life and golden emptiness that the Nile creates and has always created. The night sky is enormous. There is no city below it, no electrical light to soften it. The sky at night 10,000 years ago at Giza was alive in a way that is very difficult for most people alive today to truly comprehend. A living ceiling of light, dense with stars, the Milky Way visible as a solid river of luminescence, the planets moving in their own paths with a regularity that seemed like speech, a language that the world was using to say something important. And in the east, the lion rose. The constellation Leo, at the spring equinox dawn 10,000 years ago, climbed above the eastern horizon exactly where the Sphinx now looks. If you were standing at the Sphinx, or at the limestone ridge that would later become the Sphinx, and you watched the horizon at dawn on the first day of spring, you would see Leo rising before you, the lion rising at the place where the watcher watches. If someone stood on that ridge and understood the sky, and 10,000 years is not very long in terms of human cognitive capability, only in terms of recorded history, they would have understood what they were seeing. They would have understood the connection, and they might have chosen to mark it, to carve it, to seal something beneath it that recorded the moment, that said, in a language more durable than words, "Here, now, at this time when the lion rises at the horizon, we place something for the future to find. This is speculation. It is a story built on incomplete information and hopeful inference. But it is not an irrational story. It follows from the evidence with a certain logical coherence, and the evidence is not invented. The stellar alignment is real. The geological anomaly is real. The ancient traditions of sealed knowledge are real. The institutional reluctance to open the question is real. What is speculative is the connecting narrative, the story that links all of these real things together into a coherent picture. Maybe the truth lies somewhere between memory and ruin. Tonight, wherever you are, the stars above you are the same stars that burned above the Giza plateau when the Sphinx was carved. The light has travelled so far that the stars themselves may have changed. Some of them are gone already, their light still arriving after the source has faded. But the pattern overhead, the arrangement that the ancient Egyptians learned to read like a language, is still there. The same stars that rose above the carvers, the same stars that burned above the priests who cleared the sand, the same stars that Thutmose saw when he woke from his dream and looked up at the face of the Sphinx, the same stars that are overhead right now, while you're lying in the dark, half asleep, in whatever country you call home, listening to a story about a sealed room beneath the oldest and largest and most patiently mysterious stone face in the world. The continuity of the sky is one of the things that makes the ancient world accessible. You cannot hold the same tools they held. You cannot stand on the same ground. The ground has changed, the city has grown over it, the desert has shifted, but you can look up, and when you look up you are looking at exactly what they looked at. The lion in the east rising before the spring sun, the river of the Milky Way overhead, the slow turning of everything night after night, in patterns so regular they feel like the pulse of something alive. The ancient Egyptians believed the sky was a record of everything that had ever happened and everything that would happen. They believed the stars were the souls of the dead, the blessed ones, the pharaohs who had ascended to join Orion in the sky. They believed that the movements of the heavens above were mirrored in the movements of sacred places below, that the plateau of Giza and the belt of Orion were speaking the same language. If they were right about that, if the plateau is a mirror of something above, then the sealed room beneath the Sphinx is not a tomb and not a library and not a record vault. It is a reflection, a piece of the sky pressed into the earth, a memory of the first time kept safe in darkness until the world is ready to remember what it forgot. We have spoken of empires and geologists and seismic surveys and stellar alignments. Let us return for a moment to the people. Whoever carved the Sphinx, whether in 2500 BCE or much earlier, did not do it alone. No single person carves a monument 240 feet long. The work required dozens of skilled stonecutters, supervisors, scribes to record the measurements, priests to oversee the ritual aspects of the work, labourers to remove the cut stone and carry it away, food preparers and water carriers, and the entire human infrastructure of a sustained project. These people were not symbolic, they were real. They had names their friends used, preferences for certain foods, opinions about the weather, fears in the dark, children who didn't always survive and parents who grew old and died. They slept near the work site in the cool of the night, and in the morning they rose and picked up their copper chisels and their wooden mallets, and they continued the work of making something that would last. Did they know what the Sphinx would become? Did they understand, the people who carved the first deep cuts into the limestone ridge, that what they were making would still be standing, still looking east, still holding its question, when their descendants' had themselves become dust? They might have hoped for it. The ancient Egyptians were, in their orientation toward time, deeply interested in lasting things. The word for monument, the word for great works, the word for the things they built. These words carry within them the concept of endurance. The pyramid was not just a tomb, it was a name that would live forever. The Sphinx was not just a statue, it was a presence that would persist past the lives of everyone who made it. But hoping for permanence and experiencing it are different things. The people who carved the Sphinx have been gone for so long that they are not even within the range of memory. No story survives with their names, no inscription records their craft. They are traceable only in the shape of what they left. The chisel marks in the stone, the proportions of the figure, the decision to orient it east rather than west or south or north. The decision to leave it as a single piece rather than to build it up from blocks. These decisions are the only language we have from them, and one of those decisions, perhaps the most significant one if the surveys are right, was the decision about what to leave beneath, what to seal into the earth under the body of the lion, what to place there before the Sphinx was finished, before the guardian took its final position, before the foundation was closed over whatever was inside. We do not know that decision. We have not been permitted to know it yet. There is a certain kind of knowledge that the ancient world understood very well, and that the modern world has, in many ways, forgotten. It is the knowledge of what you do not know. The ancient Egyptians were acutely aware of the limits of human perception. Their entire theological system was in part a way of navigating an experience of the world that was saturated with the unknown, with the darkness at the edge of the desert, with the flooding of the Nile that brought both life and destruction in proportions you could not entirely predict, with the death that came without announcement and without explanation, with the sky that turned overhead in patterns that were beautiful and regular, but that no one fully understood. Their response to not knowing was not despair. It was ritual. It was the careful, repeated enactment of the things that were known, the sunrise, the flood, the planting, the harvest, as a way of honouring and perhaps sustaining the order that the unknown might otherwise dissolve. The Sphinx was part of that order. It sat at the boundary of the not knowing and looked east with absolute stillness. Whatever lies beneath it, whether it is empty or full of something extraordinary, or full of something modest, or full of something we cannot categorize, the Sphinx's relationship to the unknown is not incidental. It is structural. It is the point. Guardians guard thresholds. Thresholds mark the boundary between the known and the unknown. And in a culture that took the unknown seriously as something to be respected, honoured and navigated rather than simply conquered, the fact that something was sealed did not always mean it needed to be opened. It might mean simply that it was being kept intact, kept whole, kept safe from the erosion of time in the hands of the careless. For whom? for a time when it would be needed. Maybe the deeper mystery is not only what is inside, maybe it is what it was decided that the inside should mean. There is a particular quality to questions that have no answer. They do not stay still. They move through history, gathering different meanings in different eras, taking on the shape of whatever the people carrying them most deeply fear or most deeply hope. The question of the chamber beneath the Sphinx is very old, and it has accumulated a lot of meaning over the centuries, layers and layers of human longing and human anxiety pressing against the surface of a sealed mystery. In the medieval period, Arab scholars and travellers who wrote about the Sphinx speculated that it was a talisman, a protective figure whose power derived from the hidden object sealed within or beneath it. The power of the talisman depended on its integrity. If the sealed object were removed or disturbed, the protection would be lost. This is a worldview in which secrets are not just information but power, and in which the act of keeping a secret sealed is itself a form of magic. In the early modern period, when European explorers began arriving at Giza with scientific instruments, and the conviction that reason could unlock any mystery, the Sphinx became a symbol of irresolvable antiquity, a reminder that history extended backward into depth that rational inquiry had not yet sounded. For the Enlightenment mind, which was supremely confident in the power of investigation and documentation, the Sphinx's silence was a provocation. It asked, "Can you go far enough back? Can you reach the beginning?" In the 19th century, as Romanticism filtered through the age of exploration, the Sphinx became melancholy, the figure of a wise, ancient, suffering civilization looking out over its own ruin. Shelley's Ozymandias is not about the Sphinx, but the Sphinx haunts the poem's atmosphere. The colossal wreck in the desert, the bare and level sands stretching far away, the thing that outlasted everything except its own stone self. In the 20th century, the layers multiplied further. The mystical traditions, the alternative historians, the conspiracy theorists, the defensive Egyptologists, the sincere researchers caught in between, the tourists, the film crews, the New Age pilgrims who came at dawn to meditate. All of them brought their own meaning, their own fear, their own hope, and pressed it against the stone. The Sphinx received all of it, and gave nothing back. It simply continued to face east. This is what memory does with silence. It fills it. It has to. The human mind cannot live with a sealed door for long without imagining what is on the other side. The imagination is not a flaw. It is a necessity, a way of making the unknown navigable by giving it a provisional shape, until the real shape reveals itself. But the real shape in this case has not yet revealed itself, and so the imagination continues, and the stone continues to stare east, and the question continues. Imagine standing there at 3 a.m, no crowds, no camera flashes, no tour buses, only the enclosure, the wind, the pause, and the knowledge that somewhere below your feet the limestone may not be whole. There is one final thing to consider before we return to the silence of the desert. The Sphinx has been buried, not once, but many times. The desert is not static. The sands move. They have been moving across the Giza plateau for thousands of years, driven by the same dry winds that created the Sahara and keep it dry. The Sphinx enclosure, which lies lower than the surrounding plateau, is a natural collection point for windblown sand. Over the centuries the sand accumulated. The paws disappeared first, then the body, then the haunches. Travellers who arrived at Giza and found the Sphinx saw only a head rising from the desert, a disembodied face in the sand, enormous and serene, staring east over its own buried body with an expression that was impossible to interpret, because the context, the full scale, the full form, was invisible. This has happened so many times that there are historical records of multiple different clearings. Thutmose IV cleared the sand. The dream Stele tells us so. Subsequent rulers cleared it again when it had reburied itself. The 19th century excavations cleared it again. The 20th century clearings revealed the full extent of the body for the first time in modern memory. Every time the Sphinx is uncovered, it is uncovered from burial. And burial, in ancient Egyptian thought, was not destruction. Burial was preservation. Burial was what you did to things you wanted to protect across time. You placed them in the earth, in the darkness, wrapped and sealed and hidden from the forces that erode everything exposed to air and light. The Sphinx buries and uncovers itself. The sand covers it, and someone clears the sand. And beneath the sand, beneath the enormous body of the lion, in the darkness that the desert creates and has always created, something may be waiting to be uncovered in a different way. Not by the wind moving, but by a decision, a permit, a willingness to ask the question and not merely circle it. The records tell us what survived, but not everything that was lost, and everything that was sealed may still be intact. A door that opens ends one kind of story. A door that remains closed creates another. Late at night, when the sound shows are over and the last tour buses have gone, the plateau empties. The vendors fold their stalls. The horses and camels are led back to their stables. The lights that make the pyramids glow for the evening shows dim and then go out. And the Giza plateau is, for a few hours, nearly what it once was, a high ridge above the Nile Valley, under an enormous sky, with the desert beginning behind it and the monument standing in the dark, unobserved. The Sphinx is darker than everything else. The pyramids catch reflected light. The pale stone above them holds the glow of the distant city. But the Sphinx, lower, nestled in its enclosure, is in shadow. You would not see it easily if you didn't know it was there. But it is there, looking east, as it has always been, and beneath it the question that no shovel has yet answered, the surveys that found the anomaly, the permits that were denied, the traditions that pointed there long before the instruments arrived, the geological argument that makes the Sphinx older than expected, the stellar alignment that places the carving in a time before Egyptian civilization as we know it, the Edgar texts that describe hidden records in sealed rooms beneath the body of a guardian at the boundary of the first time. All of these threads seem, in the imagination, to gather near the same place, near the ground beneath the pores, to the sealed room, if it is there, that no living person has entered, that no instrument has fully mapped, that no authority has permitted anyone to open. Perhaps it is empty. Perhaps it is full of something unremarkable. Perhaps it is full of something extraordinary. We do not know. And the not knowing, which is maddening in one light, is also, in another light, a kind of gift. It means the mystery is still whole. The sealed room, if it exists, is still sealed. The possibility of everything is still present. The moment before opening, which is the most charged moment of any discovery, is still alive in the desert beneath the lion's body. Every morning, the sun rises exactly where the Sphinx is looking. Every morning the light falls first on that worn stone face. Every morning the question is asked again, and the stone, as it always has, keeps its answer. There is a kind of object that survives precisely because it was hidden. The most remarkable archaeological discoveries of the past 100 years, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Nag Hammadi texts, the tomb of Tutankhamun, the Lascaux cave paintings, all share a quality. They were not exposed to the air, the light, the hands of each successive generation who might have used them, worn them, altered them, misunderstood them, or decided they were no longer needed. They were sealed, kept in the dark, preserved by isolation. The darkness of the sealed space is what made them whole. If there is something beneath the Sphinx that was deliberately sealed, placed there by people who understood that time moves in one direction, but that meaning can be made to persist across it, then the darkness beneath the stone is not a tomb, it is a library, not necessarily full of books in any form we would recognize, but full perhaps of intention, of the specific choice to put something in a specific place and seal it carefully, and mark its location with an enormous, permanent, unmistakable stone guardian. The choice to seal something is itself a message. It says, this matters. This is important enough to protect across time. This is not for the people who are alive now. This is for the people who come later, when the world has changed, when our world is already the ancient past, when enough time has passed that what we knew may be needed again. The ancient Egyptians understood time differently from us. Their concept of eternity was not a vague, indefinite extension of the present. It was cyclical, the turning of seasons, the flooding of the Nile, the movement of stars that repeated their patterns exactly. Things ended and returned. Civilizations ended and returned. The first time would come again. If you believed that and you had something worth keeping, you would seal it. You would put it underground. You would place a guardian above it, and you would wait. We have gathered many things tonight. A geological argument about rainfall and stone, a seismic anomaly beneath the pores, a rectangular shape where there should be solid rock, an ancient text from Edfu describing sealed repositories of sacred knowledge beneath the body of a guardian, a dream, a prince asleep beside the buried Sphinx receiving a promise. The Turin king list with its columns of divine reigns extending back before history into a period of shadows. The stellar alignment that may, or may not, mark the Sphinx with a date 10,000 years older than its accepted age. The institutional silence that has surrounded the question of excavation for 30 years. The traditions, across multiple cultures, of something hidden beneath the sacred hill at the beginning of the world. None of these fragments make a proof. They do not add up to a conclusion that a careful historian or a careful scientist would be comfortable stating outright. But they rhyme with each other. There is a resonance among them, a harmonic relationship that suggests they are all pointing at the same place from different directions. The geologist and the mythologist and the astronomer and the seismologist and the ancient scribe have all, in their different languages, aimed their questions at the same ground. Beneath the lion, beneath the guardian of the horizon, beneath the oldest and largest stone sculpture carved from the living earth, only fragments remain. And the fragment is extraordinary. What might be concealed in the whole? The last thing we need to ask, and perhaps the most important, is not about chambers or surveys or dates or seismic anomalies. It is about why this matters to us. Why, in the early hours of a night in the 21st century, somewhere in the world, people listen to the story of a sealed room beneath an ancient statue and feel something move in them, something that is not quite excitement and not quite fear, but is somewhere in the neighbourhood of both, a quality of feeling that the deepest mysteries tend to produce. Part of it is simply the appeal of the unknown, the sealed room, the hidden record, the buried civilization. These are images that tap something primal in the human imagination. Every child who ever buried a toy and forgot where it was, every person who ever found a door they weren't supposed to open and stood for a moment before it wondering. The Sphinx and its possible chamber speaks to that part of being human. The part that is always at the edge, always curious, always slightly afraid of what the curiosity might reveal. But there is something deeper. The possibility of a chamber beneath the Sphinx, of sealed knowledge waiting in the dark beneath the guardian of the horizon, carries with it a particular kind of hope. The hope that we're not starting from nothing. That somewhere in the human past there was a moment of understanding, of wisdom, of knowledge, of achieved civilization that was preserved rather than lost, that the slate was not entirely wiped clean each time a world ended, that something was saved. This is an old hope. It is in the myth of Atlantis, which was never really about a sunken island, but about the loss of a golden age and the possibility of its recovery. It is in the story of Noah, and in every flood narrative in every culture that describes the chosen few who preserved knowledge and life against the waters. It is in the traditions of the followers of Horus, carrying the sacred plan forward from the first time into the world of human history. The hope that something was saved, that the important things were not lost, that even in the silence of the sealed room, even in the darkness beneath the lion, beneath the desert, beneath the thousands of years of forgetting, something is waiting to be found. This hope is not at its core about archaeology. It is about memory, about the fear that everything we are and everything we have learned will one day be simply gone, swallowed by time, buried under new civilizations, forgotten the way the people who carved the Sphinx have been forgotten. And the Sphinx offers a quiet, persistent answer to that fear. It is still here. Whatever else was lost, whatever civilizations have risen and fallen around it, whatever languages have gone silent, whatever knowledge has been burned or buried or simply forgotten, the Sphinx is still here, still looking east, still watching the sunrise, still keeping its secret, still. That stillness is not indifference. In the Egyptian tradition, stillness was divine. The gods were still in the way that the sky was still, present, vast, containing everything, moving only in cycles too large for human observation to track. The Sphinx's stillness is not the stillness of a dead thing. It is the stillness of something that is not in a hurry, something that has understood, somewhere in the stone that constitutes it, that time is very long, and that patience is not a virtue but a nature. Whatever is sealed beneath it has been waiting for a long time. It can wait longer. The desert at night is very quiet. This is a different kind of quiet from other quiets. It is not the quiet of a room where people have stopped speaking. It is not the quiet of a library or of a church or of a sleeping house. It is geological quiet, the quiet of a landscape that has not changed its fundamental nature in longer than any human civilization has existed. The sand, the rock, the sky, the darkness, the wind that moves fine grains from one place to another so slowly that a human lifetime would not see the difference. In this quiet the Sphinx sits. It has been asked the question many times, by the priests who made offerings at its feet in the New Kingdom, by the Ptolemaic Greeks who adapted its worship, by the Arab writers who recorded local traditions of its power, by Napoleon's engineers who measured it, by the Victorian explorers who cleared its sand, by the geologists who sent sound waves into its bedrock, by the researchers who brought their instruments and their questions and their permits and their denials. The question is always essentially the same. What are you keeping? What is in the ground beneath you? What did the hands that carved you know, and where did they put it, and is it still there? The Sphinx receives the question, and then the desert wind moves, and the stone goes on staring east. The Giza Plateau at night, without the tourists and the vendors and the sound shows and the cameras, is one of those rare places on Earth where the weight of time becomes almost physical. You would feel it in your chest if you stood there long enough, the specific gravity of accumulated centuries pressing down on the present moment, the understanding that you are standing in a place that has outlasted every attempt to understand it, the Great Pyramid behind you, the sky above you, the desert on three sides, and in front, looking past you toward the horizon, the enormous, ancient, patient face of the Sphinx. keeping something. There is an old story, Greek in its specific form but older than the Greeks in its sensibility, in which the Sphinx is not a passive mystery but an active one. In the Greek version of the myth, the Sphinx poses a riddle to every traveller who approaches Thebes. If you cannot answer the riddle, you die. Only Oedipus, among all the travellers, answered correctly, and the Sphinx, defeated, threw itself from its cliff. The riddle is famous. What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs in the midday, and 3 legs in the evening? The answer is the human being, who crawls as an infant, walks upright in the fullness of life, and leans on a staff in old age. But the real riddle the Greek Sphinx was asking, the deeper question beneath the story, is the question of time, of the stages of life, of what a human being is across the whole span of its existence, not just at one point. The Great Sphinx at Giza is not the Greek Sphinx. They are different creatures in different mythologies. But the two images have grown together in the Western imagination for so long that there is a trace of the Greek riddle Sphinx in every encounter with the Egyptian one. The Sphinx asks you something. It is standing at the edge of the known world, at the boundary between life and death, at the place where the sun rises and returns, and it looks at you and it asks something. Not a riddle with a clever answer, something harder. What did you come here to find? What do you believe is sealed in the ground beneath the things that endure? What do you hope history has kept for you? What do you fear it has lost? These are not questions about ancient Egypt. They are questions about what it means to be a person in time, to live briefly, to try to understand something, to hope that understanding can be passed forward across the distances of history, to fear that the distance is too great. The Sphinx looks east, the sun rises, the chamber, if it exists, remains sealed, and we are still asking. Somewhere beneath the limestone of the Giza plateau, in a place that has not seen light in a very long time, possibly for thousands of years, possibly since before the first dynasty of Egyptian pharaohs, there may be a door, not a metaphorical door, a physical one, cut from stone, set in stone, sealed in stone, the kind of door that the ancient Egyptians knew how to make, fitted precisely, designed to hold against time, marked perhaps with inscriptions that explain what was inside, perhaps with warnings, perhaps with nothing at all. A door that was sealed once by hands that knew what they were sealing and why, and that has not been opened since. Behind it may be nothing, or behind it may be something, but the door itself, the possibility of the door, is enough. It is enough to sit with, in the dark, while the night moves around you, and the world outside your window continues its patient turning toward morning. There is a chamber beneath the Sphinx that Egypt still hasn't opened. Maybe it is a small natural void in the limestone that instruments interpreted too generously. Maybe it is a construction deposit, ritual placing, an empty jar. Maybe it is the Hall of Records, the impossible, beautiful, terrifying thing that a sleeping mystic described 100 years ago, and that ancient traditions have been pointing toward for 3,000 years. We do not know. We may not know for a long time yet. The surveys were done, and the question was raised, and the permits were denied, and the ground was left sealed, and the Sphinx continues to face east, and tomorrow morning, and the morning after that, and every morning until something changes, the sun will rise exactly where the Sphinx is looking, and the door, if it is there, will stay closed, and the mystery will remain whole, and that wholeness, that sealed, patient, beautiful, terrible wholeness, is perhaps the thing that makes the Sphinx not just an archaeological curiosity but a living question, a question that doesn't expire, a question that gets handed down, a question that we inherit from everyone who stood before it and asked, and a question we pass forward to everyone who will stand before it and ask after us. What is beneath you? What have you been keeping all this time? The desert cools quickly after dark. All day the sand holds the heat of the sun, and the limestone of the plateau radiates warmth that you can feel against your face if you stand close. But once the sun is down and the sky goes from orange to violet to black, the temperature drops with a speed that surprises those who think of Egypt as only a hot place. The desert is a place of extremes, not just hot and cold, but ancient and new, buried and exposed, known and unknown. The Sphinx sits in its enclosure as the night deepens. The enclosure walls, carved from the same limestone ridge as the Sphinx itself, rise around it on three sides, creating a kind of theatre in which the Sphinx is perpetually the focal point, the subject, the object of all attention. From the enclosure floor, looking up at the body of the Sphinx, you understand in a new way how enormous it is. The haunches tower above you. The paws, each of them 50 feet long, frame the path toward the body. The head rises above everything, catching more of the sky than you expect. Between the paws, the dream Stele is a small object by comparison. The stone tablet recording Thutmose's bargain with the divine, so dwarfed by the paws on either side that it looks almost accidental, as if it had been placed there by a child beside an adult. But it has been there for 3,000 years, and it says, in the language of a civilization that is gone, the Sphinx spoke to a king in his sleep. The Sphinx made a bargain. The Sphinx asked to be remembered and promised something in return. The Sphinx remembers how to ask. Whether it also remembers how to answer, that is the question the ground beneath it may one day settle. The night is deep now. The stars are moving overhead in their slow eternal arcs, and somewhere far below the surface of the desert, in a place where no light has reached in living memory, maybe longer, maybe much longer, something is either there or not, waiting, or simply resting in the darkness that belongs to things that have been kept. There is a strange intimacy in the thought of a sealed chamber. Whoever seals something imagines a future, not always clearly, not always personally. But the act of sealing is an act of address. It says, "This is not finished with us. This must outlast us. Someone someday may come here when our voices are gone and find that we tried to speak across the dark." The ancient Egyptians were masters of this kind of future speech. Their tombs were not silent to them. Their walls spoke. Their statues received offerings. Their names, carved in stone, were meant to be read aloud by people not yet born. A name spoken by the living could sustain the dead. A prayer carved deeply enough might cross centuries. A monument large enough might carry a king's identity beyond the reach of ordinary forgetting. In this sense, every Egyptian monument is already a message to the future. The Sphinx may be the most mysterious of those messages because its text is missing. The pyramids tell us something through their form. Tombs tell us something through their paintings. Temples tell us something through their inscriptions. But the Sphinx gives us almost nothing from its own first moment. No original dedication has survived. No clear statement from its builders tells us, this is why we carved the lion. This is whose face it bears. This is what it guards. This is what lies below. And so the Sphinx becomes an unfinished sentence. We stand before it and supply the missing words. In one age, the missing words are divine kingship. In another, they are solar rebirth. In another, hidden treasure. In another, Atlantis. In another, geological anomaly. In another, cultural heritage and national memory. In another, a quiet story playing in the dark for someone trying to sleep. Perhaps this is why the Sphinx keeps surviving inside human attention. It is not only old, it is incomplete. And the incomplete invites us in. But it also asks us to be careful with what we add. The future listener, the one the ancient builders may or may not have imagined, is not only the archaeologist with instruments, or the official with a permit, or the scholar with a translation. It is also the person who approaches the mystery with enough humility to understand that not every silence is an invitation to invent. Some silences are invitations to listen. The Sphinx may be speaking in that way, not by giving us the answer, but by teaching us how to remain near a question without damaging it. Stone has a patience that human beings do not naturally possess. We are brief creatures. We want revelation in our own lifetime. We want the door opened while we are alive to see it. The chamber photographed, the inscription translated, the headline written before the next morning. We want mystery, but we also want resolution. We want the sealed room and the key. Stone does not want this. Stone can wait through dynasties, through languages rising and dying, through cities expanding toward it and retreating from it, through scholars arguing, kings claiming, conquerors arriving, tourists gathering, lights turning on and off each evening for the show. The Sphinx has already waited longer than most human institutions have existed. It has waited through every theory about itself. It waited when people called it a god. It waited when people called it an idol. It waited when people called it a relic. It waited when people called it evidence. It waited when people called it a deception. And beneath all those names, the stone remained. This patience can feel almost cruel to us, because it refuses to adjust itself to our hunger. But perhaps it is not cruelty. Perhaps it is the last remaining defence of ancient things against the impatience of the present. A chamber opened too soon can be damaged forever. A claim made too strongly can mislead for generations. A mystery turned into certainty before its time can become another kind of ruin. So the Sphinx waits, not because there is necessarily a secret, not because anyone necessarily hides one, but because the deepest questions in the ancient world often require more patience than the people asking them can easily bear. Tonight, that patience is part of the story. We do not need to force the door. We can sit outside it. We can listen to the wind moving across the enclosure. We can imagine the limestone cooling under the stars. We can let the surveys remain suggestive, the legends remain legends, the ancient texts remain fragments, and the silence remain whole. This too is a way of honouring the past, not to abandon the question, but to carry it gently. There is a line that every mystery asks us to walk. On one side is wonder, on the other side is belief. Wonder is open. It looks at the Sphinx, at the weathered stone, at the reports of anomalies beneath the pores, at the old stories of hidden knowledge, and says, there may be more here than we understand. Belief is different. Belief wants to arrive. It wants to turn a possibility into a conclusion, a suggestive survey into a confirmed chamber, a legend into a map, a silence into proof. Both have their place in human life. Without belief, no one would build temples. Without wonder, no one would keep asking questions after the first answer became convenient. But in the presence of ancient things, the line between them matters. It matters because ancient things cannot defend themselves against the stories we place upon them. The Sphinx cannot correct us. It cannot say, no, that is not what I mean. It cannot say, yes, you have come close. It cannot say, dig here, or do not dig here, or wait. It can only remain. And because it remains, we must learn how to speak about it without taking more from it than it gives. The chamber beneath the Sphinx, if there is one, belongs first to evidence. To stone, geometry, survey data, archaeology, conservation, and the physical reality of the bedrock. It belongs to the instruments that listen, to the experts who interpret, to the careful disagreement of people who know how easily ground can mislead. But it also belongs, in a quieter way, to wonder, because evidence alone does not explain why the question has survived. A purely technical anomaly would not pull millions of minds toward the same place. A possible cavity in limestone would not by itself become one of the most persistent mysteries of the ancient world. The reason the question survives is because it touches something older than archaeology and deeper than speculation. It touches the desire to believe that history is not exhausted, that the world still has sealed places, that the ancient dead may have left us something we have not yet earned the patience to receive. So perhaps the task is not to choose between wonder and caution. Perhaps the task is to hold them together, to say, yes, the surveys are intriguing, but not definitive. Yes, the legends are powerful, but not evidence by themselves. Yes, the official caution is frustrating, but not automatically sinister. Yes, something may be there. And yes, it may be less than the stories have promised. The mystery is strong enough to survive that honesty. A weak mystery needs exaggeration. A strong one does not. The Sphinx does not need us to make it louder. It has been speaking softly for thousands of years. If the stone could remember, it would remember more than kings. It would remember the workers who came before sunrise, when the air was still cool enough to breathe deeply. It would remember the sound of tools striking limestone, copper against stone, wood against copper, rhythm after rhythm until the ridge began to surrender its shape. It would remember the men who hauled away the cut blocks, perhaps to be used in nearby temples, and the overseers who measured the work with cords and rods, and the priests who watched for omens in the light. It would remember the first time the face appeared, not complete, not yet royal, just a plane of stone becoming forehead, brow, cheek, mouth, a human shape emerging from the rock where there had been none before. Imagine that moment. Imagine standing in the dust with your hands sore from work and seeing the first hint of a gaze in the stone, realizing that something once hidden inside the ridge was beginning to look back. It would remember the decision to leave the body as a lion, the powerful chest, the long back, the paws extended toward the east, the choice not to make a standing figure, not to make a temple wall, not to make another pyramid, but to create a creature, half animal, half king, holy guardian, lying at the threshold of the plateau as if it had always been there and had only been uncovered by human hands. It would remember the first sunrise on the finished monument, the face catching light before the body, the shadow under the paws, the river in the distance, the workers stepping back, the priest speaking words that no one now can hear, the king perhaps looking at the stone and seeing not only an image of himself but an image of eternity made visible. And if something was placed beneath it, a deposit, a token, a sealed chamber, a symbolic room, a marker of foundation or memory, the stone would remember that too. The lowering of the object, the closing of the space, the last hand to touch the door, if there was a door, the final moment before darkness became permanent. Then time would begin its long work, the first layer of sand, the first crack, the first repair, the first pilgrim, the first offering, the first person to forget the original name, the first foreign traveller to misread the meaning, the first scholar to measure it, the first camera, the first survey, the first headline, the first theory that turned a whisper into a shout. The stone would remember all of it. But the stone does not remember in words, it remembers by remaining. And perhaps that is why we come to it again and again, not because it gives us information, but because it makes duration visible. It allows us to stand beside something that has outlived the voices around it and feel, for a moment, that time is not an idea but a weight, a substance, a pressure in the air. The chamber beneath the Sphinx, whether real or imagined, belongs to that pressure. It is part of the weight of everything unsaid, everything sealed, everything waiting below the visible world. Let us return, one final time, to the paws. The enormous paws of the Sphinx stretch forward into the enclosure, weathered and restored, ancient and not entirely original. the way all long-surviving things are ancient and repaired at the same time. Between them stands the dream Stele, its surface worn but still legible enough to carry the story of a prince who slept, heard, promised, and became king. Behind the Stele the body rises. Below the floor the bedrock continues. If the reported anomaly beneath the left paw is real in the stronger sense, if there is a space there, a room-like shape in the limestone, then it has rested directly beneath one of the most symbolically charged positions in ancient architecture, beneath the foot of the guardian, beneath the threshold, beneath the creature that faces the rising sun. If the anomaly is natural, it is still strangely placed. If it is artificial, it is even stranger. And if it is a misunderstanding of instruments, then the misunderstanding itself has become part of the monument's modern life. Another layer of meaning pressed against the stone by a century that wanted to hear something from below. There is no version of the answer that leaves the Sphinx ordinary. A natural cavity would remind us that the monument is inseparable from geology, that human hands carved sacred form from a landscape already full of hidden structures made by water, pressure, and time. An ancient passage would remind us that the Sphinx was not a simple sculpture, but part of a complex architectural and ritual environment, one whose full design may still not be mapped. A ritual chamber would remind us that Egyptian sacred architecture often worked below the surface as much as above it, in foundations and hidden spaces and deposits made for gods rather than visitors. A sealed record, if such an extraordinary thing were ever found, would remind us that human history is more fragile and more surprising than any model can fully contain. And solid rock would remind us of something else, that human beings can create a chamber out of longing alone, that we can place a room beneath a monument because the monument feels too ancient, too silent, too intentional not to have one, that the hidden place we seek may sometimes be the shape of our own desire projected downward into the earth. This does not make the desire false, it makes it human, and the Sphinx has always been, among other things, a mirror for human beings, a lion's body, a human face, animal strength, and human thought, earth and mind, stone and gaze. Perhaps that is why the question beneath it matters, because beneath every monument is the same deeper question. What do we hope survived us? What would we hide for the future? What would we guard if we had the patience of stone? There is a mercy in approaching it this way, not as a puzzle that must be defeated, and not as a secret that must be stolen from the hands of officials or priests or time, but as a place where many kinds of truth overlap without dissolving into one another. The geological truth that limestone can fracture, hollow, dissolve, and echo in strange ways. The archaeological truth that ancient builders often worked with the hidden parts of the earth, cutting shafts, sealing deposits, and creating spaces whose purposes were not meant for ordinary eyes. The historical truth that the Sphinx has been reinterpreted by every age that has stood before it, from New Kingdom kings to medieval chroniclers, from European excavators to modern researchers with instruments in their hands, and the human truth that a sealed chamber beneath an ancient guardian will always feel like more than stone. It will feel like a promise. This is why the mystery survives even when caution is applied to it. Caution does not kill the story. It gives the story room to breathe without turning it into something brittle. A mystery that depends on exaggeration can collapse the moment one claim is challenged. But a mystery built from genuine uncertainty, careful evidence, ancient symbolism, and human longing can survive correction. It can become quieter and stronger at the same time. So tonight we do not need to decide what is beneath the Sphinx. We only need to understand why the question has endured. Because some places gather questions the way desert hollows gather sand, slowly, layer by layer, until the question itself becomes part of the landscape, and perhaps that is enough for a night like this. Enough to let the mind drift without forcing it towards certainty. Enough to imagine the pale face in moonlight, the shadow under the pores, the unseen layers of limestone below, and the instruments that once listened for emptiness there. Enough to hold the Hall of Records as legend, the surveys as suggestion, the ancient texts as fragments, and the official caution as something more complex than simple refusal. The mystery becomes calmer when each part is allowed to remain what it is. A legend does not have to become fact to matter. A survey does not have to become proof to be intriguing. A sealed place does not have to be open tonight to keep its power, so the listener can rest inside the question itself, where history, myth, evidence, and silence meet, without needing to become one simple answer before morning. The door remains closed, but the path toward it has become quieter, clearer, and more honest tonight. Before the ending, return once more to the physical place. Imagine the Sphinx enclosure after midnight, when the tourist paths are empty and the limestone has lost the last warmth of the day. The pores do not look ceremonial now. They look heavy. They look like a weight laid over the desert itself. The shadow between them is not dramatic. It is simply dark, and because it is dark, the mind begins to descend. This is how the mystery works. It does not need to shout. It only needs to place one unanswered space beneath one ancient guardian, and let the centuries gather around it. A hollow echo, a rectangular signal, a denied permit, a text about first time, a legend of records sealed beneath sacred ground. None of these things alone is enough. Together they create the shape of a question that has outlived almost everyone who tried to answer it. And there is one more reason this visual matters. A mystery that remains only in the abstract grows thin, but a mystery that can be touched by the imagination becomes durable. The listener does not stay because a theory is complicated. The listener stays because they can see the place, the moon, the pause, the stone, the darkness under the body, the quiet line where the desert floor meets the carved enclosure. So return to the ground for a moment. The limestone beneath the Sphinx is not a blank surface. It is layered. It is fractured. It has been cut, weathered, restored, patched, buried, cleared, measured, and argued over. Somewhere in that layered stone, instruments have reported disturbances that do not behave like perfectly solid rock. Somewhere in that same ground, legend has placed a room. Somewhere above it, an ancient culture placed a guardian facing the dawn. This does not prove the legend, but it explains why the legend found such fertile ground here. Some places invite stories because they are vague. The Sphinx invites stories because it is specific. It has a body. It has pause. It has a gaze. It has a threshold. It has a buried history of its own. It has known passages, disputed readings, a dream stele between its forepaws, traditions of sacred time, and a physical landscape that is still not fully simple beneath the surface. That combination is rare. A monument can be old without feeling alive. A ruin can be famous without feeling secret. But the Sphinx does both. It is visible to everyone and still somehow withheld. It has been photographed millions of times, and yet the most powerful part of the story is the part no photograph can show. The underside, the possible cavity, the unentered space, the question below the image. That is why the story does not need to end with the discovery. It has already reached the place that matters most for a sleep history mystery. The edge of the known, where fact is still fact, legend is still legend, and the mind can drift without being asked to believe more than the evidence can carry. There are moments in human experience that do not resolve. They do not arrive at an answer. They do not close neatly. They remain open, not out of failure, but out of a fidelity to the truth of uncertainty, which is that some questions are bigger than the instruments we have built to answer them. The chamber beneath the Sphinx, if it exists, is one of those moments. It carries within it everything we do not know about human origins, everything we have lost about the deep past, every civilization that rose and flourished and was forgotten before anyone wrote its name down, every piece of knowledge that existed somewhere in the world before the fires and the floods and the slow work of forgetting. It carries, too, the specific human desire to be known, to leave something for the future, to say, in a language more lasting than words, we were here, we understood something, we kept it safe for you. Whether the chamber exists or not, whether the anomaly in the bedrock is a room or a fissure or simply the way limestone sounds in that particular place, the tradition that points to it is real. The human desire that animates the tradition is real. The mystery that the Sphinx embodies, with its wrong-proportioned head and its water-eroded enclosure and its east-facing gaze and its seismic anomaly and its denied permits and its ancient dream Stele, that mystery is entirely real. And the mystery is, in a deep sense, about us, about what we can know, about what we allow ourselves to ask, about what we keep sealed because we are not ready to open it, in the earth, in the past, in ourselves. The Sphinx was carved by people who understood something about time. They built for it. They built against it. Across ancient Egypt, important things were often placed underground, sealed carefully, protected by ritual and architecture, entrusted to darkness because darkness could preserve what daylight might destroy. And then the sand came and covered everything, and the Sphinx waited in the dark, its face above the sand and its body buried, looking east toward a sunrise that kept coming morning after morning, year after year, century after century, millennium after millennium, until someone dreamed beside it, until someone cleared the sand, until someone sent sound waves into the earth and heard what might have been a reply, until now. Somewhere beneath the desert west of the Nile, the night is very deep. The stars are turning, the limestone is still, and whatever is sealed in the dark beneath the oldest guardian in the world, whether it is everything or nothing, whether it is a modest ancient feature, a natural cavity, a misunderstood anomaly, or the simple silence of solid rock, it has been waiting a very long time. It is in no hurry. The question is whether we are. If you're still listening from wherever you are tonight, from your bedroom or your couch, or somewhere the dark has found you and the world outside has gone quiet, thank you for sitting with this mystery. The Sphinx will still be there tomorrow morning, facing the sunrise. If there are other old silences you'd like to drift toward, other sealed rooms in the ancient world, other places where the earth is keeping something, let me know in the quiet, somewhere in the comments below. Or just rest now. Let the desert hold the question for tonight. Kingdoms at night.